We'll finish our poppy. So we are going to add some axis randomization that we weren't able to do yesterday because we ran out of time. And I'll have a quick look at wind, the emphasis being on quick because you can spend a lot of time simply tweaking the wind. Then we're going to save out a so-called component of our poppy that we're going to reuse later. And then we're going to take a look at how you can model all other blossom forms by using the Hydra node and the Urchin nodes. And then we're going to reuse that component to put that newly modeled blossom on top of our plant. And so you can see how quickly you can generate new species from reusing parts that you saved out. And then we're going to tackle modeling mushrooms. Actually, I prepared the modeling of mushrooms with a segment node. But today I gave it a try and redid one mushroom with the flower node. And it turned out really great. So we're going to model two different kinds of mushrooms. One with a segment node to see how that works, and one with a new flower node where we will use some tricks to get something else than an open tube. And then we will create a mushroom generator interface. So we will publish a couple of settings to a custom interface, and we'll create drop-down menus that will allow you to switch between both mushroom species and to switch between a group of mushrooms or a single mushroom, to give you an idea on how you can create interactivity for your plants. And out of these published settings, we're going to create some presets, and these presets would be available in Vue if you exported the plant to Vue. And then we'll have a final question and answer session. Okay, so let's jump right into PlantFactory. Yes, okay. So I made a few tweaks to the poppy. So I edited the profile shapes of the petals a little more to make things a little less tall. And I also adjusted a couple of X perturbation settings where I had a typo yesterday in one of the settings. So that's why things didn't look quite the way that I wanted them to be. Okay, so one thing that we actually didn't tackle yesterday was the axis setting and the gravitropism setting. So before we get back to our poppy, let's load up the flower node into an empty scene again. And this time we're going to place the flower node on a cylinder so that we have different copies of that node on the side of that cylinder. So let's place it at the surface, and let's increase the scale. A little too big. Okay. So I'll disconnect the meta node again. And one thing that we didn't talk about was the gravitropism setting. So basically what this does is if you have a flower node that is not pointing straight upwards, but is rather pointing to the side, similar to what we have here, then the gravitropism settings can influence the shape in such a way that it looks as if gravity bended the tube downwards toward the ground. So by simply increasing the gravitropism setting, you can see that the tube starts to get deformed, and this is great for a certain kind of bushes where you have trumpet-like blossoms, for example. And if I were to add this flower to the top of the segment, so let's start this one from the tip and set the angle to 0, then you can see that the gravitropism is not going to have an effect on the top one, even though we're using the same node, because this one is pointing straight up, so gravity has no influence. If I change the angle, you will see that the more I change the angle, the stronger the effect of the gravitropism gets on the top tube. So once this points to the side, things start to bend towards the ground as well. So just to round off all the settings in the flower node, I wanted to mention this one. And the next thing is that we haven't talked about the axis. So you cannot directly manipulate the axis in the 3D view as you could with a segment. Instead, you have to enter this editor by clicking the icon here. And then you can add control points and manipulate tangents and start to move this thing around. So by clicking apply, you can already see what's going to happen. So that's a neat way of adding more variation to existing tube forms. And maybe we can see a better effect of that axis influence setting. So it's not distorted enough, but anyways. Okay, so we want to add some variation to our flower by manipulating the axis. However, there's only one axis available in the flower node, so we need to find a way to randomize that axis. So for this, we're going to create a meta node, and we're going to make use of two different types of nodes. So first, let's extract the axis. I just have to take a look whether that was for the inner or the outer petals. No, it was for the outer. Okay. So let's click on axis and connect the parameter. And theoretically speaking, we should get a meta node. Why aren't we getting a meta node? Okay, we're not getting a meta node for whatever reason. Then I'll simply insert it manually. So the node that we need to use can be found in a miscellaneous category. No, sorry, in the spline category. And this is the axis spline manual node. We don't need that one, so we can delete that. And now we have our editor that we can manipulate. And I would like to copy this node a couple of times so that we have about 4 different kinds of axis shapes. And in preparation for today, I already saved out a couple of different axes from within that editor. So let's load them into the dedicated nodes. The first one is going to remain static, so here we'll stick to the default axis. Let's load in the next one. And the last one. Okay, so now we need to instruct PlantFactory to pick randomly between all of these different axes. And there is a node for that to be found in the miscellaneous category, and this is called random inputs. So with this node, you can add randomness to everything that doesn't have randomness built in by default. So let's simply connect all of our 4 axes to that random input node and connect the result to the axis input of our outer petals. And now we can group this to make things a little clearer and call this random axis shape. Let's color this red because it's connected to our outer petals. And now by clicking the randomize button, we should actually get some variation for the petals. It's a little hard to see if the plant changes that much. Let me simply turn off the stock for a second so that we get a better idea and connect the outer petals to the root. Zoom into that. And now let's generate a couple of new variations. I'll turn on the wireframe. Yes, now you can see the effect of the 4 different axes. So it's just a very slight bend, very subtle, but it adds some additional variation to our plant. So this finishes the modeling of our poppy. Even though it might not be botanically correct, I hope you enjoyed that project and learned a couple of new techniques for modeling the poppy. Now let's have a look at wind animation. Wind animation is probably one of the less intuitive things in PlantFactory. And I covered it in detail in one of the past webinars. I believe it was the first one from last year, the second session. Still, I'd like to give you an idea on how wind works in PlantFactory as a general basis. So by going to the wind tab here, you can configure the global wind behavior for all plant parts at once. So basically, if you enter the the atmospheric breeze settings, the atmosphere editor will open. You probably know that one from Vue if you're a Vue user. And just think of the atmosphere editor as a panel that defines the intensity and the speed of two different kinds of ventilators that are present in the scene that blow wind invisibly onto the plant. And one ventilator is sort of a directional ventilator, which is the gusts of wind. So with the directional ventilator, the plant really bends into a certain direction. Think of a tree that during a hurricane where all the branches bend into the direction of the wind. So this is the gusts of wind. And then we have a basic breeze, which is more like a vibrating sort of movement. And PlantFactory differentiates between these two kinds of ventilators, so the breeze and the wind and gust motion. And consequently, many nodes have both settings available. And depending on which one you turn on, that plant part is reacting to either only one of the two ventilators or to both. And you can find all the wind settings on the Influences tab. And so here you can see that we have that basic breeze motion, which is the ambient motion breeze. So this will not bend the plant into a specific direction under a strong wind. It will simply cause a fast sort of jittering movement for the plant. And if you really want to bend that plant, then you have to turn on the wind and gust motion. And the wind and gust motion only makes sense, of course, for branches and for stalks such as this one here. It doesn't really make sense for smaller stuff such as the capsule or the leaves. So just think about which parts of a plant would be deformed by wind that's blowing to either side, and which part of a plant wouldn't be affected by that and simply move up and down, for example. So let's take a look at the wind. I'll click that icon, and we can preview the wind. And if I add a constant wind on top of this that is blowing into a certain direction, let's do that. You can see that the plant, the stalk bends into the direction of the wind. I can change the wind direction and the plant will change its bending direction. And if I go back to the stalk and turn off the wind and gust motion, you can see that the plant is not bending anymore because, as I said, for that constant bending effect, you will have to use that wind and gust motion. And the ambient motion breeze is just a slight movement into a specific direction, as you can see, but no true strong bending. And so this is how wind works in PlantFactory. Just differentiate between the kind of movement that you'd like to use. You can use both in combination. So in this case, we have that vibration of the breeze and the bending of the wind and gust motion. And you can set the effect of the strength of each ventilator for each plant part separately. And on the wind tab, you can boost the strength for the breeze and for that wind for different kinds of nodes, for example, for the leaf nodes, for the segment nodes, or for blades that we're going to use today separately. So instead of going into every single segment node, if the wind is too weak for your taste, and increasing every setting manually, you can simply go to the influence of wind on segments group and, for example, increase the influence of the speed on all segments. And so this is a global control for tuning your plant. And it also allows for some additional settings. So on this tab, PlantFactory also takes the entire shape of the flower into account. So for example, if you have a tree, you could make a longer or thinner branches actually move stronger in the wind. And yeah, so that's only possible on this tab. So by using a combination of individual settings and this tab, you can fine-tune the wind. And one thing that I always like to keep in mind is that this basic breeze here is meant to simulate a very calm day with only a slight wind movement. So for my taste, this movement would be too strong for our flower. So I would go and tweak the settings and reduce the strength. And then I also load a preset for a stormy breeze and take a look what my plant looks like when we have a strong storm or hurricane. And obviously, this looks totally crazy. And so I tweak the plant until it looks good under strong wind conditions and under mild wind conditions as well. Because if you load the plant into an ecosystem in Vue and you load several of your self-made TPF plants into Vue, then of course all the plants should have been configured with the same kind of breeze settings in mind, or else you will not get a uniform look. So this concludes the short view on the wind settings. I'll have a look at the checkbox to see which questions kind of popped up.
Yeah, a couple of comments from Karen.
If the user uses a high wind. Do you mean that blue wind triangle in Vue, in the top view in Vue, Karen, that you can drag? Yes, okay. So that blue wind triangle is the constant wind in here. So if we were to save out that plant right now with another strength than 0, then the plant would already load into the scene with a manipulated version of that blue triangle. If the plant itself does not have the wind and gust motion active, then the blue triangle could be dragged, but it wouldn't have any sort of effect at all. No problem. And you wanted to know whether the pedals could flutter. Yes, they can. So I'll just deactivate wind and gust for the stalk so that we get a better view. And let's reload the default breeze settings. And let's turn on wind for both pedals. So again, on the transform tab, here we only have the ambient motion breeze, because it doesn't make sense to truly bend pedals, so we have only that subtle movement. And as you can see, that movement is much too strong. So with the flexibility setting, we can actually influence the shape of the movement, so whether the entire plant part rotates at once or only ever so slightly, or whether it's truly deformed. So let me turn on the wireframe, and you can see that the wireframe is getting morphed. And again, we can use that orange filter curve, for example, to restrict the movement only to the outer parts of our pedals. So let's deactivate the wind movement for the inner parts, and now we can see that only the edges of the pedals are moving. So if I increase the strength of that, it's more clearly visible. And now we only have the outer edges moving. Okay. Now, are there any more questions regarding our poppy flower? If not, then I'd consider this to be finished, and we can move on to the other topics for today. Yes, you can make the bud move as well. So actually, it would be enough to turn on the wind and gust motion and ambient motion for the side stalks, I believe, because that should already generate quite a convincing movement, but if you want to move the bud individually as well, then let's just turn on the ambient motion for the bud in addition. And I'll turn it off for the stalk again to get a better idea. Now I can see that the bud itself is moving. It looks a little too flexible, as if it was an egg that is about to hatch. But again, you can change that influence with the orange filter curves. Okay, a timeline for keyframes done. Unfortunately, you need Vue to animate the intensity of wind and breeze. PlantFactory does not have animation capabilities with keyframes built in. What you can do is you can export the entire plant with a rigged bone structure into another application with the animation either pre-baked or just as a rigged version without animation, and then you can animate it manually in Maya or Cinema 4D or any other application, which is of course very tedious for complex plants with dozens of bones. The other option is to use a point cloud. So you can, sorry, not point cloud. You can bake the animation to, where was it? I need to check. Export geometry. Yeah, apply wind. Yes, you could export it as Alembic, for example. And export animation. Yeah, and you could export it, as I said, without the animation, only with the bones that are rigged in the plant, with animated points so that the animation is baked, or with animated bones. And if you have Vue, then yes, you can keyframe that animation individually, but it doesn't work on its own, unfortunately. Is it possible to tint the flower textures? Yes, that's possible. Generally speaking, you can create totally procedural materials everywhere in PlantFactory. However, using procedural tints will only be interpreted correctly inside Vue, because the procedural solution currently cannot be baked to a bitmap. So I rather suggest to really use different kinds of pre-made textures in Photoshop. And if you click this plus next to alternate materials in any node, then you can add another material to your plant, and PlantFactory will randomly pick between all these materials. So currently, you cannot mix and match both materials on one tube, because this is one part of geometry. But if these were individual nodes or children, then each child would have a different texture. So that might be a way to do that gradient thing non-procedurally. Karen, about the global wind setting, you meant that you don't have to go into each node and turn wind on there. Instead, just one checkbox, and that turns on wind for every plant part? Okay, no, that's not possible, because you need to define what kind of wind animation you would like to use for each plant part. So there's no wizard that decides this for you. You really have to do it manually, I'm afraid. Yeah, sorry. Yes, Sylvia, you can also use leaves to create flower petals. So actually, let's create a new scene, and I will show you the different kind of node options that you have for creating flower petals. So we already had the flower node in detail. So let's add that leaf node again. And the leaf node is still that flat polygon that you can subdivide up to 4 times in total. and that you can deform by using these settings in here. And you can alpha map this for creating leaves or petals. Works perfectly. You can also create crossed planes. So this would be for real-time applications such as games, where you'd use a alpha map material. Let's use one of the preset ones, for example, this one. And now we have a real-time low polygon cross-plane leaf. And you can also use 3 crossed planes. So now we have a horizontal one as well. And of course, these can also be animated for real-time purposes. And R6 also brought a diamond plane. And so the difference with the diamond plane is simply that it isn't rectangular, but has the shape of diamond. So depending on the shape of your texture, this might be a better solution for texture placement or even for saving polygons. Then we have billboards as well. So let's actually spread that leaf on a segment with branches. Let's add a 3rd level. Zoom out. Okay, looks great, doesn't it? And let's connect that leaf. And now if I rotate the camera, you can see how the polygons start rotating with the camera. So these are camera-facing leaf cards, and they work well in view. And again, if you want to export this, then you have several options of baking them. For example, you can bake them into a specific direction, or you can bake the current orientation from the viewport. So these are all options that are available in the file export dialog for billboard baking. Instead of that dynamic orientation, you can also say that they should be baked with that current orientation. So when I move that camera now, you can see that the orientation stays the same, and I just baked them according to my viewport. So that's one of the options that are available in the export as well. You can always make them point outwards, so along the axis of the parent. This is what that would look like. And you can also always make them face the x-axis. So instead of straight up, you could place them into a specific x direction. And yeah, we already had dynamic facing camera. And if we go back to fixed user defined, then we are back to our individual leaves. So the leaf node is very versatile, especially for real-time applications. And it can be used not only for leaves, but for petals as well. The next option for creating leaves is the warpboard. And honestly, that one is sort of obsolete. If you know the old solid growth plants, the technology that Vue used before TPF came to the market, then this is the kind of leaf shape that all the old solid growth plants from Vue 4 and up actually used. So this is again a plane that can be bent by using the curl and flexibility settings. You might know them from the plant editor in Vue. They have the same name there, and you can influence the width and length of that thing. But since the new options with the mid-rib angle and the subdivision were introduced for the leaf node, I've never used the warpboard again, because the leaf node can do the same, and you have a ton of more control over this. So in my opinion, the warpboard is only there for backwards compatibility. I'd never use it anymore. And the final option for creating petals or leaves is the blade option. So the blade is actually not a separate node. It's rather part of the segment node. Let's connect the segment. And now let's go to the first tab and activate blades. So blades create sort of a sheet of paper that runs through the cylinder in the middle. So if you want to get rid of that cylinder and just stick to the blade, then you can simply set the radius to 0. And now all we have left are blades. And blades have several advantages. For one, they offer the most control over all leaf creation techniques. You can create leaves with real 3D depth, and they also have special kind of wind deformations that is not available for the leaf node, for example. And so blades are very useful for creating detailed close-up geometry, and you can also use more than one blade, similar to the crossed planes that we just had. So if I add a number of 2 or 3 or 4, then you can imagine that this is going to look great with pine trees, for example. So let's reduce the length to 1 or 2, I don't know. And let's load that alpha material that we just had into the blade slot, pine leaf. And if I turn off the wireframe, then we have rather good looking pine leaves. And of course, as of the moment, all our intersecting blades are still totally flat. But once we start to curl them and deform them, the optical illusion is pretty convincing, and it's hard to really make out that this is not real geometry, but simply alpha mapped planes. I can show you this with one of the example trees that ships with PlantFactory. So let's load that white fir. And here the branches, the needles are done with blades. So it looks really good. It almost looks like 3D geometry. Of course, it's slow to render because all of these things are alpha maps. But when I turn on the wireframe and select highlighting, and for example, these needles, then you can see that in reality, these needles use blades for creating the appearance of a 3D look. So that's what blades are used for. And that concludes the overview of all the different kind of leaf nodes and petals that are available for creating leaves and petals in PlantFactory. I think the amount of option is really exhausting, and there's not really anything left that you couldn't do, in my opinion, except for leaves with real thickness. But as far as I know, that's only possible in a DCC application, so that you would model the leaf externally with thickness, maybe extrude it a couple of millimeters, and then import that self-modeled leaf or petal shape by using the object node, where you can import external meshes and distribute it along your plant. The pine cones are billboards, rotating billboards, actually, with alpha maps. Any further questions so far?
Okay, just checking back in the chat. I can't see any others.
No? Okay. Thanks, Karen. Okay, then let's get back to our poppy and save out that component. Or before we do that, let me explain what a component really is. So, why isn't that taskbar hiding? It's obscuring the view. Hold on a moment. Yes, okay. So you might have noticed that brush icon over here. So with that brush icon, you can draw plants freely in 3D, and by default, PlantFactory will add a modified preset of an advanced segment node. And if I continue to draw, then PlantFactory intelligently decides what to draw next. So you can see that it drew a branch. And the great thing is that you can not only rely on this manual, automatic drawing, instead you can load different kinds of brushes. And these brushes are components. in TPF lingo. So TPF ships with a limited section of components. So I could load a pre-made component, for example, this one. And now that's my current brush. And if I draw in the 3D view, that pre-configured trunk shape is being drawn. And now I could load a different brush. For example, one with twigs and leaves, and start drawing that one. And this way you can interactively draw plants in the 3D view. Alternatively, you can still load a brush down here. That task bar is annoying. Okay, so let's reload that brush. And instead of drawing each branch manually, you can click that plus button and the graph, the branch is added intelligently to our plant so that you don't have to place each instance manually. And yes, you can make your own brushes, Karen, and this is what we're going to do now with parts of our poppy. So let's load our poppy. And the thing that I would like to reuse is the combination of the main stalk and leaves. So as the first step, let's delete everything except for the leaf and the connected noises and curls and the stalk from our scene. Okay, so now we have lots of empty child tabs that we can remove. So let's select each empty tab that we don't need anymore and delete it. So that we're only left with that leaf tab. And the final one. Okay, for the leaf, I would like to reset all filters so that we're back to sort of a default connection between stalk and leaves. And let's reset the density and let's unlink the number from the stem length. Yeah, and I think that's fine. Okay, so in order to save this one out as a preset, we simply have to group these nodes into a meta node. And by the way, I forgot one thing. I would like to add an empty tab. So I click on that name, go to add children, and I'm going to add an empty slot. And here we are in our empty slot. I'll rename that one to Blossom. And let's reset the angle of anything that we are going to connect here to 0 so that the blossom points straight up. And we're going to place the blossom at the tip of the segment. And now let's group these nodes into a meta node. And if you save out a meta node that contains a 3D geometry, then this is not going to be saved out as a default meta node, but as a component. So save, and already saved that one in advance. And now we just created our own brush that we can now load from the content browser. There it is. And I can now either draw it freely in 3D or add it to the scene. So in this case, TPF didn't know what to do and added it on top of the of the existing stock. And so by building more and more plants, you can save out common structures such as a stalk with leaves attached to it. And then you can simply load that one into an existing scene and modify the length of the stalk and the placement of the leaves and replace the textures. And you don't have to rebuild everything that we did yesterday with that curl, and you don't have to create a segment first and then a leaf node and connect it. Instead, just use that preset and modify it to your liking. And so that's what we're going to do now. I'm not going to save this. And so let's load our newly saved component and click plus, add to graph. And I still need to change this to centimeters. It's a little huge. Yes, that looks better. And now we're going to have a look at alternative ways to model blossoms instead of using the flower node. So I will ungroup the node so that we get access to our individual settings. And I already created that empty slot here, that blossom slot. So for this exercise, we want to create something that is similar to a chamomile shape, just as a general idea. So we want petals in a circular arrangement of the top at the top of our stalk. So let's add a leaf node. Where is it? There we are. Okay. And I would like to distribute this leaf node in a circle. And for this, we're going to use the Hydra object, which we used yesterday. So just as a reminder, the Hydra itself does not generate any kind of geometry. It only spreads connected geometry in a circle. Let's attach the leaf to our Hydra. And let's zoom in a bit. And the leaf is much too tiny. So let's increase the size and let's load another material. For example, this kind of petal. Let's decrease the width a little further. And let's reduce the radius of that circle, something like this. And now we're going to add some depth to our petals by adding some curvature with a bit of randomness. And maybe here as well, I don't know, 0 plus minus 15. This is just me playing around. And some midrib angle. And we need more subdivisions or this is not going to work. Yes. So now we have some random looking petals. And I'll also add some variations in scale, maybe plus minus 15%. So let's change this to relative randomness. And now we have a slight variation in scale and not all petals have the same size. So with that Hydra node, we can influence the angle of our petals. So let's move this a little more upwards. And let's increase the number quite a lot. And we could also rotate the petals into the other axes as well. So maybe 0 plus minus 8 degrees. And we could also rotate them sideways just a tiny little bit. And maybe a little more. Also 8 degrees. And here plus minus 5. So now we have a nice randomized petal arrangement. And now we need to place a stamp in the middle of our arrangement. So let's add something that we can actually deform into sort of a half sphere shape. And for this, we're going to use the urchin. So the urchin creates a sphere. Create a new child and call this one stamp. And again, we're going to place this at the very top and with an angle of 0. And now let's go to the Urchin tab, and first let's reduce the radius. Maybe a little further. Okay, so I'll increase the resolution of that sphere. So the Urchin itself is a very special node. It first creates a ball-like shape. So there's also a dedicated ball node in here, but the ball is nothing that you can manipulate. It will always be a round sphere. The only way you can manipulate it is by stretching it and squashing it. And you cannot connect anything to the ball. So it's nice for faking, I don't know, oranges on an orange tree in the distance. And with the Urchin, you actually can create, can connect other children to this. So let's connect the leaf to the Urchin to give you an idea. And I'll disable the Hydra for the time being. And now with the Urchin, we can indicate how many petals we would like to have on that spherical surface. We can select whether the petals are always going to be orthogonal or whether we want them to point into a specific angle. So the Urchin is, for example, a very good way to create rose-like arrangements with layers and layers of single petals. And the most interesting setting is the phi angle. This is known as the magic angle in math for whatever reason. And it resembles the angle that most flowers in nature actually use for distributing things on a revolving surface. So by changing the angle, you can clearly see what that thing does. So now we have sort of a staircase arrangement of our petals. So by using that phi angle, you can create awesome animations, as you can imagine. If you keyframe this, then you get fantastic fractal animations in view. And I'll stick to the magic angle by default. And I just wanted to show you that you can use the Urchin to create that kind of flowers, or maybe damn it, Christian, can you help me? Löwenzahn. Dandelion. I just came up with the English word dandelion. So that would be the way to go for a dandelion. Okay, so let's disconnect the leaf again and activate the Hydra object. And I would like to manipulate the shape of that Urchin. And we don't want a stem that's perfectly round. Instead, we want a flat bottom. So by editing the profile in here, which is along the z-axis, I can now make this a flat bottom. I thought you knew, Christian, so wouldn't have had to look it up for me. So now you can see that I actually cut off the bottom part of our stamp. If I wanted to, I could also make that spherical surface irregular, just to show you this. Here we are. So it's a really flexible node that allows you a lot of freedom for modeling intricate things. And now we can use that pivot offset setting to move our stamp down again. Yes, Karen, you can use the Urchin to put bumps in there with a map. Just load a corresponding material onto here. Actually, I'm going to do that now. And I'm not going to do that now because I forgot to save out the material. I'll do that later. But yes, I would like to distribute now sort of seeds along that stamp. And for this, I would like to have a tube-like structure, so nothing fits this better than the flower node. So let's connect the flower node and make the scaling of the instances a little smaller. And let's increase the resolution of that seed distribution. And they're still a little too big. They're intersecting. And I could now also add some scale variation, for example, plus minus 20%. Let's do that. And now to break up that totally regular angle distribution, I'll just add a tiny bit of variation in here, plus minus 3 degrees. Oh, that was already too much. 1 degree. Let's add a couple more. Yes, and now we suddenly have something that resembles a chamomile or something similar. So by using the urchin and the Hydra object, you have great ways of creating almost any kind of blossom type. Actually, I manipulated the distribution of the leaves a little bit while I prepared for the webinar, and I textured that stamp yellow and created a couple of copies. So these are still the poppy textures for the stalk and the leaf. But if I had leaf textures for a chamomile flower, I could simply go into the leaf node, replace it, and by reusing that preset, I quickly created an entirely new species. So that's what it would look like with a yellow textured stamp with seeds in the middle. And of course, you can then save this out again as a component, and then you can draw the entire plant in a new scene. Any questions? Yes, you can see the poly count by clicking that show information button down here. So this plant currently has 124,000 polygons. And by unsubdividing it, you can save quite a lot of polygons if the plant is viewed from far away. And by the way, you can influence the polygon distribution and generation on the meshing tab. I'll create a new scene for that, and this will also answer your ecosystem question, Karen. So let's add a segment node, and let's perturbate that segment node strongly so that it looks really weird. Okay, if I now show the wireframe, we can see that we need more polygons. And polygon distribution is totally regular. So this is great topology if you want to export the plant into another application, such as ZBrush, for example. And but it might also be that you're satisfied with the plant and you don't need a clean topology. Instead, you want to save some polygons, which would be a good idea for ecosystems. So by going to the meshing tab, you can switch from a uniform topology to an adaptive topology. Now let's take a look at the polygon count, 8,700. Now if I switch to automatic adaptive, we just halved the polygon count for the price of irregular polygonal topology. But this is really great for saving polygons. So TPF will use an algorithm that detects strong bends and details in the plant and will adaptively put more polygons there and less polygons anywhere else. And there are two different settings for this algorithm. One is optimized for quality. This means that this is optimized for saving the most polygons, and the plant is going to be used in a static render, and it's not going to be animated. And you can also click optimize for animation. And this means that in order to prevent any artifacts when animating that plant, TPF will add more polygons to those areas that are the most important when animating and bending the plant with the wind algorithms. So you can switch between both settings. And you can now see that we even exceeded the amount of polygons that we had with uniform distribution. So be careful with the optimize for animation setting. You can also switch to triangles if you prefer, or to a mix of quads and triangles. And in this mode, triangles will only occur at the top of the segment nodes at the caps. So you can see here we have triangles, and everywhere else we will have quads. And finally, you can also define the resolution totally manually. So if we switch to manual meshing and back to quads in my case, we now have new settings available in the segment tab that were previously inaccessible. And now we can define the amount of polygons along the height, along the axis, and along the circumference. So by increasing this, we get more polygons around the circumference, and by increasing that one, we get more polygons along the height. So it's totally up to you how you want to control the topology of your mesh. And my recommendation for ecosystems is adaptive meshing, optimized for animation, because ecosystems can be animated in the wind. And in that case, you should subdivide the plant a couple of times so that you don't create too many polygons in this mode. Regarding ZBrush, I don't have ZBrush, so I cannot speak from my own experience. But if you do have ZBrush, you can do a right click on any part of geometry and send selected primitive to ZBrush. This will use the procedural GOZ bridge between ZBrush and other applications. So in this case, the object would be loaded in ZBrush. You can modify it in ZBrush, and then you can press the GOZ button, and then the mesh in PlantFactory is going to be updated, and you keep all the procedural elements. Only the skin is actually exchanged with the ZBrush modifications that you made. So everything still remains fully procedural. There's also a tutorial on YouTube on the EON channel about the TPF ZBrush integration. Short one. Okay, then I would like to show the modeling of blades as the last flower topic for this webinar. So again, let's add a segment. I'll subdivide this a couple of times. And let's activate blades, change this to centimeters. And let's set the radius to 0 so that we're only left with that blade. And the length is a little too long. Let's use a length of 5, I don't know, and maybe a blade width of 3 or 2.5. And now I'd like to show you how we can actually create 3D depth with such a blade. So first, let's add a material. That was the wrong slot. We want to load the material for the blades. Yes, so now we have a pansy pedal. And I would like to deform this pansy pedal similar to what we can do with the leaf node so that it has a rounded shape. And for this, we have that section filter. By default, that section filter represents one side of the plane, and it's going to be mirrored over to the other side. This happens when the style is set to symmetrical. I would like to set the style to full width because I prefer working with the entire width, and it allows for more variation. I keep changing to centimeters because we're working with flowers, and as far as I know, there is no global setting, I believe. No, there isn't. You need to revert this to centimeters every time, as far as I know. Okay, so let's edit this section filter. And let's use a curve. And I will select that point, move it up. And that one as well. Now we can see how that plane is actually bending. So this is similar to what we can do with the leaf node, but if I add just some tiny bits of variation here and there to make this thing a little less regular, then we're already in territories where we have a lot more control and flexibility over the shape of our blade compared to our leaf nodes, where it can only curve this along the width and length. And we can change the amount of deformation with the section height parameter. So if I increase this, the effect of that filter curve gets stronger. And if I decrease this, then things become more subtle. And next, we can also use that profile filter. So let's reset the material for a moment. Let's use that one again. And the profile allows you to model leaves in 3D instead of using alpha maps. The only downside is that you can only model entirely symmetric leaves. So I'll change this to a curve again. And let's do something like this. Yeah, and now the width is a little too big. But the advantage now is that we have, let's change that to uniform again. The advantage is that we have real 3D geometry, which is faster to generate, but which creates more polygons. And if I now load that fancy texture again, you can see that the filter curve actually cut off the texture. If you don't want this, then you can use that pinching parameter. It works either with 0 or 1. So if I set this to 1, then our texture is actually shrinked down and not cut off. So it depends on what you want to use. If you don't have a texture with alpha maps, and instead you use a rectangular texture where you really want to cut out real 3D geometry, then set pinching to 0 and else set pinching to 1. We'll reset this now. And let's get back to our width of 2.5. And now I'm going to show you a nice variation trick. Here we have that section filter, and similar to what we did with the axis for the flower node, I would like the section to vary so that not every petal has the same sort of 3D depth. So let's extract this by clicking Connect Parameter. And this extracts both the filter and an attached radial setting, and the radial setting basically tells TPF that that filter is going to be applied along the axis. So if I remove that radial node, then that filter is not going to work anymore. So that's why TPF automatically inserts that radial. Now, we could do something similar to what we did with the axis. So I could copy the filter 3 or 4 times and then use that random inputs node, connect all the filters, and connect the random result back to our pansy pedal. But there's actually a more elegant node for this, so that we don't need several nodes. And this node is called a multi-curve. So let's delete that one and connect the multi-curve to our radial input. And I will copy that filter. And the multi-curve combines several curves within one node. So at first, it looks like a regular filter curve. But if I go to the second tab, probabilities, I can add more than one filter curve to that node. And now I will paste that first filter. I will also paste it into the other fields and make some modifications to each of the filter curves. So let's delete a couple of points here and there and maybe move that one down. These down as well. And that one is going to be totally round. more or less. Don't need that point anymore. Yeah, I think I'll remove that fourth filter again. 3 are enough. So select the fourth filter and click delete. Okay, and next to the filter curve, we have that probability column. So we can enter the probability with which TPF chooses each curve. So for example, if I were to enter a probability of 0.5 in here, then TPF would choose that filter curve 2 only half as often as filter 1 and 3. So that's basically the same as using that random input node, but instead of having to use 4 copies of that filter plus the additional selector node, we have everything neatly within one node. And let's connect this to the section. And the great thing is that we can now also use all the biases for influencing our blade, because remember, we still have that axis running through the middle of our blade, which is currently invisible because we set the radius of the cylinder to 0. But if I set that back to 50% or 20%, and I'm going to start to bend that cylinder, you can see that the blade bends with that cylinder. So by resetting the radius to 0, we have a nice bent leaf pedal. And we could even twist that thing, etc. So by using blades, you get all the settings and options that you have for regular segments. And you have a lot more control than with the simple leaf node. So for close-up plants and petals, this is the way to go. I could simply create a stalk and attach our petals to the tip of the stalk. So I would like to have one group with 2 petals, and they should be placed at an angle of 0 degrees, and we need to rotate it a little, 90 degrees, and they should start at the very top. So let's say the top is borderless, start at 100%. Now that was maybe a little too much, and the curl is too strong. I'll reduce that one. Oh, local coordinates would work better. Yeah, okay. And maybe a curl along the x-axis would be better. I don't know. Yeah, anyways. So let's reduce the diameter of our stalk and move the petals slightly down. Okay. Now it works as expected. Maybe increase the diameter of the stalk a little. Yeah. So if you imagined that we were to model an entire pansy flower by using that saved up preset, then the blades would be the way to go for this kind of flower. So that concludes all the different kinds of flower techniques that I wanted to show in the webinar for different kinds of blossoms. Any questions?
Okay, any questions on that last section or any audio comments so far? If you want to say something on a microphone, then raise your hand, let me know, and I'll put you on the mic. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section.
Okay, and this is going to be a fun section. We're going to create mushrooms. Finally.
Yes.
So first, let's use a regular segment. So this is the easier solution for creating mushrooms. And I'll call this chanterelle because that's one of the kind of species that we're going to create. And we're already working in centimeters, so that's good. So mushrooms are pretty tiny. Let's use a length of 4 ± 1. And for the radius, I'll set this to user defined so that we have more control. And let's start with a value of 2 and see what that looks like, ±0.3 maybe. And so the trick for creating mushrooms out of segments is that we're going to create that mushroom base and the cap with the radius filter. So that's why I use such a big radius, because we're going to thin out that radius at the base of our mushroom. So let's take that curve and move it down. Maybe something similar to this. That's not exactly what I want. Okay, so now we have an umbrella-like shape for our mushroom. Let's subdivide this a little more. And I think I'll reduce the radius a little bit. The umbrella is a tiny bit too wide. And I don't want every mushroom to be perfectly symmetrical. So let's go to the Transform tab and add a little bit of variation, or maybe 0.2 should be enough. Whoops. So that we get a non-uniform mushroom shape. Okay. Next up, we need to change the shape of our cap so that it's not flat anymore. So let's edit our cap profile. And let's change the cap shape to something like this. You can already start to see our mushroom shape appear. And maybe I will activate smoothing as well. So now we have a smooth border between our base and our top cap. I think I'll adjust that just a little further so that we get a more rounded transition. Like, okay. And next, let's load the textures or the materials that I prepared. So for the body, or rather for the root, because it's inheriting it from there. Let's use that one. And now we need to correct the tiling. And for the tiling, let's use a tiling of 5 along the circumference and a tiling of 1 for V. And currently this looks awful because the material continues on the cap. So we need to load a specific material for the cap. And this looks more like a traditional chanterelle mushroom. I'm not quite satisfied with that transition over here yet. It's a little harsh. Yes, that looks better. Okay, so now we will make this top irregular by using that section filter. So we had that section filter yesterday for the seed heads, and this time I will add a loop right here and another loop at the very top. So up until here, the plant will have a perfectly round shape. And now let's select the other loop and simply add a couple of points. Make this a little irregular in shape. Something like this. Maybe here, here. We can't make things too extreme or else the texture on the top is going to be too distorted. So let's click OK. And now we have a nice irregular mushroom shape. Again, we could extract that section and you copy it a couple of times and then use a random input node to introduce different kinds of shapes for our mushroom. But I think you get the idea, and due to time constraints, I will not add more randomization to that shape. But I can only suggest that you do that on your own because it's really fun. Next, let's bend that mushroom a little. So I would like to use a curl in local coordinates. And let's make that curl really strong, 2 ± 1. And we're going to curl that along the local x-axis. Okay, so of course, that's not exactly what we want. But the fun thing is that with the irregular shapes of mushrooms, we can simply play around with random shapes for our ending of our mushroom. Maybe a little less here. A little less randomization. Okay, so our mushroom is starting to look a little more elaborate. Karen TPF ships with a couple of filters, but they are all taken from Vue. So yes, there is a library. If I load a filter, the content browser will pop up, hopefully. Takes a while to load. So these are not filters that are made for plant shapes. As I said, they are carried over from Vue, but you can still use quite a number of filters for different effects and simply see what kind of effects you can achieve. And of course, you can always save out your own filters and build up your own library. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is I would like to add a little bit of displacement to the geometry. So for this, we're going to use a simple noise node, Pro noise and gradient. And let's connect this Perlin noise to our materials group and to segment body displacement source, and we'll do the same for the cap because we also want to displace the cap. And let's fold this. And now I need to activate displacement for both the cap and for the body. Let's fold the other things. And so let's increase the displacement strength for the body a little. See what that looks like. And that's a little too much. And I would like the displacement to disappear at the very top, because else there can be blending issues if the cap and the top are displaced differently by the noise. So let's just remove the displacement at the very top of our base. And now let's increase the amount of displacement for our top. And add some variation to it. And if I subdivide the plan a little more, yeah, it's not adding much except for polygons. So this is our new chanterelle mushroom. I'll call this displacement because we're going to be reusing this node for our second mushroom species. So let's create a couple of variations to see what that looks like. And as I said, if you used more section filters, then things would look even more natural. And by the way, all the variations that you create are visible within the seed field in here. So if you want to get back to a particular variation, in this case, the beginning of the scene, simply enter 0. And we're back to our first variation that we had while we were modeling our mushroom. So I'm going to save this out. And then we will add the second species. And our second species is going to be a king oyster mushroom. And for this one, we are going to use the flower node for a simple reason. We cannot create overhangs with our segment node, but that is definitely possible with the flower node. So let's go to our flower node. And for the moment, I'll deactivate that mushroom. Flower node. Again, we don't need that trumpet. Okay, and the oyster mushrooms are much bigger than these tiny chanterelles. So let's increase the length and let's increase the radius to about 6.6 plus minus 0.5. And we will set the plug influence to 0 so that our shape will only be controlled by the profile filter that we're going to use here. So I thought, well, by default, we have a tube. So how can we turn this tube into a mushroom-like shape? And actually, I tried simply moving that point upwards, the other one downwards. So basically, we're inverting that profile to create a closed hull. Let's turn off the snapping. And so that's how I tried to create a mushroom-like profile. And because you can spend quite a lot of time tweaking these profiles, I already made one today that I saved out. So let's load this. Click OK. And here we are with our non-tube flower anymore that resembles a perfect mushroom. Now, one thing that I had a little trouble with today was the creation of the textures, because the texture is now mapped from the very top of that mushroom. So the center of the texture has to be the cap. Then around the cap, we need the underside of our mushroom. And then the last thing is going to be that stem. So I played around in Photoshop a bit. It might not be the best texture in the world, but I think it's sufficient for demonstration purposes. So if I edit that material, you can see what I made. The caps in the middle, then we have that underside, and then we have the base of that mushroom. And if we take a look down here, we can clearly see that the underside is not correct as of yet. And for this, we can simply turn down the axial mapping. This will move the texture downwards. And that might have been a little too much. But anyways, it looks a lot better now. Enough shadows. Okay, so next we are going to displace our king oyster mushroom with that same noise that we used before. This nice brownish color so that we can distinguish it. And so again, let's unfold our flower, go to the displacement mapping group and connect the displacement as the source. And now let's activate displacement, and we increase the subdivision to see what's happening. And I think we're good to go with our mushroom. Again, I'll add a tiny bit of size variation, plus 0.15, and here plus 0.2, or sorry, 0.33, so that we have a variation of thirds. And I'll add a little bit of scaling variation in here as well for the other mushroom. Okay, so now we have our 2 mushrooms, and they're basically finished. So let's create a couple of additional variations. That one was too strong. So we need to limit the strength of our displacement a little. And maybe use the curve so that the displacement isn't quite as strong on the top. We need to invert it because we inverted that profile. And let's create a couple more variations for control purposes. Okay, I think that doesn't look too bad. And again, I would like to make the axis vary. So we have our axis setting in here. And just to show you that you don't have to load up an axis manually and again use that random inputs node, you can also use a procedurally generated axis with the axis spline function node. I have no idea how that works mathematically. Absolutely no idea. But you simply enter numbers in here for rotation and for translation, and you can enter lengths in here. Usually I create a length that is sort of similar, at least 2/3 to our to the length of our model. And let's use some values in here, and maybe plus 0.1. And I don't know what that step scale does, but you can simply play around with the settings. And now if we create new variations, we should see bendings of our plant and strange artifacts. Why are we seeing strange artifacts? I didn't have that one before. Let's see. Okay, maybe I'll remove the axis spline after all, but it's not too bad. It's a nice idea to generate splines procedurally by entering some mathematical numbers and let TPF do the magic. But apparently it's not so sufficient with the flower node. Efficient because the flower node is very touchy, very sensitive. It works better with segments. Okay, then we'll just leave the mushroom as it is. Next, I promised that we were going to build a mushroom generator, and that's what we're going to do now. This is where things will get a little more complex, and I actually wrote down an entire page of diagrams so that I can rebuild this without trial and error in the webinar. So if something is not going to work immediately, please be patient. I'm sure I will find the mistake, but maybe my notes are so good that I'm not going to make a mistake. We'll see. Okay, so what would I like to achieve? I would like to build two different kinds of drop-down menus. One drop-down menu will allow you to select whether you want to have a single mushroom or a group of mushrooms. And the second drop-down menu will then allow you to select the species, whether you want the single or group of mushrooms to be chanterelles or oyster kings or both randomly. So the first question is, where can we find a node that contains a drop-down menu? All nodes that can be used for creating interfaces such as checkboxes or drop-down menus are to be found in the constant numbers category. And so a Boolean number is a checkbox because it's either checked or unchecked, a two-state option. And in order to create a drop-down list, we need that value from list button. I will save the scene in the meantime. And so with that value from list, we can now enter our drop-down options in here. So let's first create the drop-down menu for selecting between a single mushroom or a group of mushrooms. And click Save. Now we have that drop-down menu. I'm going to show you a very handy panel that is also available in Vue that I use all the time. This is called the Node Observer. This panel shows you the values that each node generates. So if I select that value from list, we can see that with a single mushroom, the node outputs a value of 0. If I change this to the second option, the node outputs a value of 1. If we had a third option, it would output a value of 2, and the next option a value of 3, 4, 5, etc. This is important to know because we want to use this value to drive some selections of which nodes should be generated in our scene. So that's how that combo box works. I'll color that one in a blue color and click OK. So since we can now select between single mushrooms or groups of mushrooms, we first need to create a group of mushrooms. So the easiest way to create a group is to use a Hydra object. So let's add a Hydra, connect this to the root, and the Hydra should consist of both mushroom species. So we're going to let TPF pick randomly between both. So let's add a miscellaneous node and use the random children node. So anything that you connect to here is a choice that is offered to TPF, and TPF will randomly pick from this choice. So we can also see that our king oyster is too big. It overlaps our chanterelle mushrooms, I guess. Ah, no, it doesn't. I still have the chanterelle deactivated. Ah, there we go. Okay, so let's reset this to 1. Still a little too large. Maybe something like this. Okay, so TPF now randomly picks between both species, and we could now stick to that and use the Hydra angle to make things rectangular, increase the radius, etc., to distribute them in a group. However, we will always have the issue that the circle is going to be visible, and we don't want to have a group that is placed in a perfect circle. We want to have an irregular placement. So let's disconnect the Hydra, and I'll reset the angle to 0. And instead, I will add an add segment node. And for this segment, let me have a look. I will make the segment a little shorter. So maybe 7 plus minus 2, I don't know. And I will call this a dummy object because we are going to make this invisible. And this will work similar to a null object in other applications. So dummy distribution. And now let's connect our random species to our dummy distribution. And we want to have, I don't know, 7 plus minus 1, or maybe 3 plus minus 1 if that's too much. And let's increase the radius of our segment. And I think we should also increase the length. And now let's rotate our mushrooms along the height. Okay, and I can already see that the length is insufficient because things overlap. So maybe we need to decrease the scale of our children a little. And the oyster is not decreasing. Okay. You see, usually when you edit the scaling of an object, this scale is passed on to everything that is connected to it. So this would be passed on to a branching level, and this branching level will pass it on to the next one, etc. And on the transform tab, there is that option which is called scale inherit. And this option is not present in the flower node. So that's why that scale is not passed on through this node and this node and this node to that oyster node. So I'll simply decrease the oyster nodes manually and maybe reduce the size variation a tiny little bit. And then let's reset the scale of the other children. Okay, so now let's reset the radius to 0. Oh, that was the scale. And now let's make this dummy object invisible. For this, we'll go to the segment tab and set the skin to none. And here we are. We have a group of mushrooms distributed totally irregularly and not with a visible circle by using that intermediate dummy object. So let's save this out and let's build that interface. So Paul, how much time do we actually have left? I didn't take a look at when we started the webinar.
Okay, well, we started this session officially around 8:15 UK time. So officially,
okay, about 20 minutes.
Yeah, officially you've got that.
Okay, if we are not going to manage to build the entire interface in time, then I'll simply do it partially so that you get an idea, and then we'll load up the prepared finished scene that I built in preparation. Okay, so we now need to turn this into a control for building either a single mushroom or a group. Yes, Karen, you're actually right. I forgot to add some angle variations to the instances, because if we edit the angular variations, then we should be able to make this thing look less regular. So now they're rotated in different directions. And if you want to make them hover above the ground, we could use that move out setting, for example. So let's set this to ±2, or maybe a little too much. Now some of them are, of course, hovering in midair and not touching the ground anymore because we just made them move upwards to the ground, but they look less regular now. And yes, we could also make the dummy object a little curved. Make them look less scattered. I think I'll reset this because I don't want them hovering in midair. Okay. So as I said, we need to drive some sort of selection with that drop-down node. So how can we do that? In the miscellaneous category, there is the node select two children. In here, you can connect two different options. And TPF selects which option to generate based on a value that is compared with this level. So if the value in here is equal or smaller to the level, then the first output is going to be built. And if it's bigger, then the second output is going to be built. Now let's remember, when we select the first option, this node outputs a value of 0. And by selecting the second option, this node outputs a value of 1. So we would instruct this node to say, okay, if the value from that drop-down menu is equal to 0, then please build output 1, a single mushroom. And if it's not equal to 0, in other words, if it's bigger than 0, then please build output 2. So let's feed the result from our drop-down menu in here as a value. And we're going to connect our single solution in a moment. And for the moment, let's connect our second solution, our group, to the second output. So when we select the group of mushrooms, this output is now going to be built. If we select the single mushrooms, then this output is going to be built. So next, the question is whether that first output with the single species should be a particular species or a random species. So we need, again, another selector. So let's copy this. Let's disconnect this. I'll call this single group so that we know what kind of selection this is. Same for here. And this one is supposed in single mode, if we have a single mushroom, to select either a specific species, so either a specific or a random species. So we will create a second drop-down menu, and this will have the options of chanterelle, king oyster, or random. Let's save this. And let's connect this to the value. It's another color so that we can clearly visualize the data flow in a few moments. Okay, and this is called species. Now, let's connect this option in here. So once again, this drop-down menu first says, okay, we're going to have a single mushroom or a group mushroom. And in case we're selecting a single mushroom, we will go to a second selection, and in here we will decide which kind of single mushroom species we're going to build. So this is not a decision which one of the 3 species we're going to build. It's only a decision between random or not random. So we need another decision maker, so to speak, another select two children, because either we are selecting a specific species or we are selecting a random species. So for the random species, we can connect this to our random children. So once again, if we choose a single species, then we'll go this way. And if we choose in this menu that we want the species to be random, then we will go this way and we will build a random selection of chanterelles or oysters. Okay, so now we have the problem that we have three options, chanterelle, king oyster, and random, but we can only select between two different inputs. So we need to summarize the first two options into one option, so that we will output either a value of 0 for both first options, so that we will go this route, or we will output a value of 1, so that we'll go down that route. So for this, we're going to change the values that this drop-down menu creates and limit them to 0 and 1. Again, by default, chanterelle creates a value of 0, king oyster creates a value of 1, and random creates a value of 2. So I would like to output a value of 0 for both chanterelle and king oyster, and a value of 1 for random. So let's edit that filter. And the minimum value that our drop-down menu creates is 0. The maximum value that it creates is 2. Okay. So I would like to change the value of 0 and the value of 1 to 0. And then let's change any other value to 1. Let's connect this result in here. And that should do it, I guess. I have to look at my notes. Yes, okay. And now we also need, so if we select either of the first two options, chanterelle or oyster, we will use the input 0 and we'll go down this way. If we use the second option, we will go down that way. And so for selecting the first option, oyster or chanterelle, we will now need to define which one of the two is going to be built. So this one is for the single option, the decision between chanterelle and oysters. And again, we need to limit this to a value between 0 and 1. So 0 will mean that we're going to build our first output, which will be our chanterelle. And 1 means we're going to build our second output. So in order to transform the values from 0 to 2 into 0 to 1, I will use a map filter, but of course we could use that graphical solution as well. So our drop-down menu outputs values from 0 to 2, and we will change these values to 0 and 1 and connect this to here. And finally, I think we can give it a try. So let's say we're going to create a group of mushrooms. Of course, I haven't connected anything. So we need to connect the very first node to our graph. So a group of mushrooms. And this should theoretically create a group. Yes, there we are. And if we now switch to a single mushroom, then we are here for a single mushroom, and we should be able to switch between chanterelles and oysters. And finally, between a random choice. Yes, we can see that the third option, random, works perfectly. So let's switch that back to a group of mushrooms and see what's going to happen if we change this to chanterelles. Nothing, okay, because we haven't linked that one yet to our group. So this is the final switch that we would need to implement, but since we're running out of time, I will simply load the ready-made mushroom generator with the final switch into the scene. There it is. So we basically built almost everything except for the last solution, last selection. I know this is pretty complicated. I hope you still sort of got the basic. And why isn't that saved? Okay. Let's save this and lock this. Yeah, okay, so it works for the single group, and the descriptions are actually wrong. Single mushroom or group of mushrooms. Save this. Type. Yes, so now we have two drop-down menus that are offering a nice combination of single mushrooms or a group of mushrooms. And we can now use this to build a couple of presets. So I will lock this option so that this is no more editable, that these menu entries. And this is necessary for creating our custom interface. So let's click the name of the setting and set this to publish parameter. And I will call this amount of mushrooms. And if we check allow external access, then this setting will be available in the Views Plant editor. And then we're going to publish that second menu and call this mushroom species. Allow external access. And if we now go to the presets tab, we have our two drop-down menus available. We could even publish the end setting of our dummy object where we grow our mushrooms from. So let's publish this and call this spread amount. Because if we decrease this, then all the mushrooms are going to move closer together because they're not allowed to grow up until the end of our invisible dummy object. So to give you an idea, we can use the setting to spread the mushrooms out a lot more. And so we just created a custom interface with a number of settings. And now we can create, for example, a random group of mushrooms. And we will store our current settings and call this random group of mushrooms. And now let's change this to a chanterelle group. And okay, I edited that preset by accident. So let's change that back to random, save that. Okay, and now let's go back to custom to create a new preset and select chanterelles and save this one out as chanterelle group. Click OK. And save this. And let's go back to custom and do that same thing for our king oyster group, store this preset. If you want to, you can also edit the description and load another picture in here, so that's no problem. And now let's do the same for our single mushroom group. So I think in this case, let's start with the chanterelle, single chanterelle. Save this out. Next, we'll create a single king oyster. And finally, we'll create a random single mushroom. Save this, and now as a last preset, let's switch that back to a group and move the spread this a little more out and save this one as okay. So we just created a couple of presets, and we can switch between all of those presets on the fly in here. And when we load up the plant in Vue, all of these presets will be available for loading into the scene or into an ecosystem. Vue will ask you what kind of preset you would like to load. Karen, I believe the thumbnails are only displayed in small in here. We could actually export that plant to Vue and take a look at the content browser. And I believe that this will create bigger previews. So this could take a few seconds. I'll load Vue. And now let's load our self-made mushrooms. Okay, so we just exported everything as separate presets, but let's load the default one. Yes, so you can see that the thumbnails are definitely bigger. Of course, you should turn off the info button before creating a thumbnail, but as I said, it's easy to replace the thumbnail with your own custom picture anyways. And if we click any of these presets, then we just loaded the plant into Vue. And let's position this at the scene origin. And yeah, I believe it's so tiny that we'd have to enlarge it quite a bit. Oh, no, I think that's okay. Ah, there we are. Okay, let's move that a little more into Vue, enlarge it. And there we are with our self-made TPF mushroom plants in Vue, ready to render, ready for a scene. And our presets are also available in the plant editor, and the published parameters are available as well. So this concludes the webinar. I think we managed just about 2 hours. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any more questions, we have a final question and answer round now.
Yeah, please ask a question. Take advantage. Otherwise, I've posted a link there for our Facebook community group. If you think of something over the next day or two, then post a question there. I've already placed up a post with the event poster at the top of our feed. So comment or put your questions there. We've seen some really powerful things today with PlantFactory, thanks to Daniel.
Thanks, guys. I'm glad you enjoyed it.